There we go. Okay, great. Welcome to everyone to this session on two of the newer chapters in reclaiming our democracy. I just want to say the book Reclaiming Our Democracy was published 28 years ago. So the title, Reclaiming Our Democracy, is 28 years old, but so be it. And I'm thrilled to be with you. I'm going to start very briefly with my story of self. I think I'm going to tell a shortened version of it. Some of you have been with me, and I tend to start with my story of self. It's like, what happened in your life and what decisions did you make that got you to this moment or this commitment? And so very briefly, here's my story of self. I was born in Miami, Florida, and I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in music. And I played percussion instruments in the Miami Philharmonic Orchestra for 12 years and taught high school music. And 41 years ago, I founded the anti-poverty lobby, Results. And a lot of times I'm asked, music, poverty lobby, what's the connection there? And when I look back in my life, there's certain experiences that start pointing me in a different direction. I graduated from high school in 1964 and learned at the graduation ceremony that a high school fraternity brother of mine, a year younger, had died the day before. And 4 years later, in 1968, right around college graduation, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. In both of these cases, I was really asking, what is this life? What is this death? Why am I here? What am I here to do? What is my purpose? No answers, but the questions are getting clearer. And then 9 years later, I'm invited to a presentation. This is 1977 on ending world hunger, put on by the Hunger Project. And I go to this thing thinking, well, hunger's inevitable. What do I know? I'm a musician. I mean, it's inevitable in my mind because there are no solutions, because if there were solutions, somebody would have done something by now. This is ordinary thinking. But I got to this thing, and right away, it was kind of obvious that there's no mystery to growing food or clean water or basic health. I'm not hopeless about the perceived lack of solutions. I'm hopeless about human nature, people. We'll just never get around to doing the things that can be done. But there's one human nature I have some control over, my own, and my questions. Why am I here? What am I here to do? So I get involved in a big way. This is the end of the story. In 1978 and 1979, I spoke to 7,000 high school students, classroom by classroom by classroom. And before I went into the first classroom, I read some statements from the US National Academy of Sciences, Food and Nutrition Study, and others calling for the political will to end hunger. So I asked 7,000 high school students, what's the name of your member of Congress? I didn't want to know if they wrote them. I didn't want to know if they met them, just the name. And out of 7,000 asked, 200, fewer than 3%, could answer correctly. And 6,800, just over 97%, could not answer correctly. And results started out of this gap between the calls for the political will to end hunger on the one hand, and the lack of basic information on who represented us in Washington on the other. So that is my story of self, and a good idea of what happened in your life and what decisions did you make that got you to this commitment or this moment. And maybe an exercise, if you've not done that, to kind of think through and write out your story of self. Let me tell you what we're going to do. I think we're going to jump right to it. We urge folks to read the chapters beforehand, or just come and listen to stories of inspiration from those who've done the reading. And we ask you to keep these two questions in mind as you read. The first was, which of the activist stories moved you the most in the CCL chapter and why? And in the next chapter, of the 13 commitments needed to succeed in our deeper form of advocacy, which are your two strongest areas and which are two areas for growth? I don't know if you're able to, so let me put the chapters in the text just in case. I want to see if there's anyone who has read that first chapter of the two, the CCL chapter, and picked an activist story, maybe you picked a couple, that you found to be most moving. I'd like to know which story and why. And frankly, I'd love you to read it and we could discuss it. Now, I've picked two myself, so if we don't have anyone, that's fine. But is there anyone who would go down to the reactions button at the bottom, click on it and raise your hand if you've identified a story from the CCL chapter that you would like to point out and frankly, probably read aloud. So is there anyone who has one that you would like us to start with? It's fine if you don't, but I want to make sure we don't step on anyone's toes. Okay, great. So don't be shy. If you've got one and you want to go after me, you can do that. Now, don't forget, this was published in about 2013, the 20th anniversary edition. So this is from CCL in about 2011. CCL is like 4 or 5 years old. And it's about volunteers at the time named Madeline Para and volunteers at the time named Ellie Sparks and the like back then. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to start from right here. This is Ellie Sparks' story. It's at the bottom of page 1 of the online version of the CCL chapter. And Ellie's, what's going on here is CCL had its conference in DC in July of that year. I believe it's 2011. And this is the August national conference call. And people are telling about the sessions that they led or co-led at the conference. And Ellie talks about joining CCL 18 months earlier, suffering from climate trauma. She would say, I would read Bill McKibben's book, Earth, and I would weep at home and I would weep at work. And then she found CCL, and 18 months later, she's co-leading this workshop on creating relationships with members of Congress and editorial writers. I'm going to see if someone could, can you read this, and would someone want to volunteer to read a paragraph or two of Ellie's? Go ahead. John, why don't we start with you, John Sabin, if it's clear enough for you to read.
Starting with our director, Mark Reynolds.
Yes.
Our director, Mark Reynolds, likes to say, we're betting the farm on relationships. Then he tells us that we need to build relationships with members of Congress and editorial writers. Most of us CCL volunteers have never done that before. What in the world does a relationship with a member of Congress look like? How do we connect with an editorial page editor? Some of us have found models for those relationships in other parts of our lives. Gary in Boston uses the model of a work relationship.
Okay, and don't forget, this is about 10 years ago. Why don't you go right there?
My relationship model is different. I adore romantic relationships, so I use romance as my model. That first meeting with the editorial writer, it's like a blind date, only you've decided beforehand you're going to marry this fellow. You are going to be sweet and interesting, but not too intense. If it doesn't work out with the editor, you're going to marry one of his friends at the newspaper, the business editor, environmental writer, or city editor. Someone at this paper will find you interesting and compelling. It's just a matter of being persistent until you find the right connection.
Okay, great. And if I could just interrupt and say, what she found was that her babysitter's father wrote for the paper, and it was her babysitter's father that helped her know who to contact at her paper. And her member of Congress, who we don't mention in here, but he's not been in Congress for 6 years or more, was Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader at the time. And so go ahead, why don't you continue?
I see the relationship with a member of Congress as an arranged marriage. If you live in her district, the member's aide has to meet with you. That's what our congressman's legislative director told us in January. Since then, we've met 5 times with the LD in 2012.
Yeah, so this was 2012, excuse me. So since from January to August, they are meeting 5 times with the legislative director. Go ahead.
We schedule 45-minute meetings with him. He keeps us for well over an hour. He doesn't want us to leave. Why? Because a good arranged marriage starts out cold and heats up over time. That's different than a love match, which starts out hot and slowly cools down.
Yes, okay.
I see the editorial page writer as a painter. His canvas is the editorial pages. His palette is filled with letters to the editor, op-eds and editorials. I am his muse, model, and assistant. I want him to fill his canvas with colors that I like. So I'll have my group send 3 to 5 letters to the editor whenever the opportunity arises. The more colors I put on his palette, the better chance of having him pick 1 or 2 of my favorite colors.
Okay, great. And you're doing a great job. Could we have someone else continue on and volunteer to read? And I don't know if I'm going to see anyone raising their hand unless you do it with Cheryl. Why don't you go ahead? That's great.
Last summer, he printed 3 climate denier letters from international denier groups. At first, the denier letters felt like a blow to the gut. Then I dug deep for the love language. My editor was proud of his work in standing up for the climate. Those denier letters were in response to his own articles encouraging conservatives to help conserve the climate. He had been courageous in writing those editorials. He was getting national attention because of them. He was not backing down. I thought he might enjoy a pat on the back from across the nation. I called Gary in Boston, a scientist in New York, and our CCL director in California. All 3 sent letters. All 3 letters were printed. I guess I was right. My editorial page editor likes national attention.
And you're doing great, but I'm going to read the last paragraphs because it's so mind-boggling for me. She said, during our conference the previous month, it would have been, I guess, July of 2012, I met with 20 congressional offices. I would assume it was all of Virginia and then a few neighboring. I met with 20 congressional offices. I met with many folks whose view of the world was very different than mine. Going into their offices was hard. I had to let go of a lot of emotional baggage. I could no longer judge them or hold hostility in my heart towards them. I had to let go of my fear of climate change and my fear that they wouldn't listen to me. I had to center myself in love, releasing fear and centering in love. This is sacred and profound work. I'm going to read that once more. I met with many folks whose view of the world was very different than mine. Going into their offices was hard. I had to let go of a lot of emotional baggage. I could no longer judge them or hold hostility in my heart towards them. I had to let go of my fear of climate change and my fear that they wouldn't listen to me. I had to center myself in love, releasing fear and centering in love. This is sacred and profound work. Does anyone remember where she started? She didn't start at this is sacred and profound work. Where did she start? She was suffering from what? Anyone remember?
Like climate depression or something.
Yes, climate trauma.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this story, in a sense, shifts from climate trauma to sacred and profound. That's quite a shift. And a lot of times I like to talk about, like Hari Han does, transactional advocacy, sign this petition, transaction complete, compared to transformational advocacy, where the advocate sees himself or herself in a new light, see themselves as community leaders, see themselves in ways they never imagined possible. And this, from climate trauma to sacred and profound, I think is a good example of transformational advocacy. I would like to hear from a few people. What did you learn from that? What might your takeaway be? Is there somewhere you've been a little stuck or slow that what you just heard and what you just read opened up a new possibility? Does anyone have some reaction? Maybe you've read it once or twice or three times, or maybe that was your first time. What is it your takeaway? How in any way do you see something in a new way? And that reaction button at the bottom and then clicking on raise hand makes it really easy to see who'd like to say something. Now I'm going for my love of silence right now.
Well, I've got one.
Yes.
We are really stuck with our relationship with our congressional office right now.
Okay.
And so rereading this takes me back to first principles a little bit, which is, I think, something that we need to do in my chapter.
And could you say something about first principles or something we need to do? Flesh that out a little bit more.
So the just like when you learn anything, you know, we've all had this the centering on relationships training and focusing on respect and gratitude and acceptance of where the person whom you are trying to draw into relationship is at. But over time, it's really easy to get a little bit cynical about that. And refreshing that text and remembering what it was like to do that the first time and do it most sincerely is very useful to me.
Okay. You were alluding to maybe going back to Ellie saying, I like romance as my model, but maybe not literally that. But.
Well, as actually, I mean, yeah, it comes through in Ellie's thing, but it's also, I don't remember whether it was in this part of the reading or the other, that, you know, we're in the relationships business, and part of the training is to do like Ellie did and let go a little bit of your own concerns and fear as you, or anger or whatever your emotions are.
Yeah.
As you have these, as you try to have these conversations with people. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, one of the things that makes it harder for me is I actually have such compassion for the staff people in these offices. They are so overworked.
And maybe underappreciated sometimes.
And generally unappreciated. And when you're just getting nothing from them, part of me is says maybe now is just not the right time to push.
Okay, and I would also say, rather than maybe now is not the right time, is there another messenger in the community who, if they went with us, maybe led with us, maybe whatever it is, that a door would open that seems to be more closed? Let me go to someone else. Is there one more? What a takeaway, kind of an insight into where you might step back in, where you had pulled back with editorials or letters to the editor, or we were just thinking anything else before we go on to one more in this chapter?
I think I saw Cliff's hand up.
Okay, who was that?
Yeah,
Chris?
Cliff.
Cliff, go for it, Cliff.
I think, I'm not sure I would have picked the same thing, Sam, as in fact, I had picked the same one to talk about. That was really striking, what Ellie Sparks said there. I'm not sure that's the model that would work for me, romantic, but I think what she's aiming for is developing a trusted relationship with her member of Congress, and everything I've read, and it just makes good sense that you start out with deep listening. You really need to listen to their point of view, and you can't just sit there and nod. You've got to kind of echo back the things they're saying to
Right.
make it clear that you're hearing their point of view. I think that's the first step, and maybe addressing that like a romantic relationship. That's her model, not mine. But I think it's nevertheless it's interesting. It's a good point.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see if anyone has another excerpt. We're going to leave this chapter in a moment. Does anyone have a different excerpt that you were thinking of lifting up or raising up? And I might find it and put it on the screen if I can find it quickly. Do we have any hands raised to pull up a different chapter, section or story?
I don't know. I've got one.
Okay, can you
Maybe
tell
I'm
me
talking
which
too
one
much
it
here, but
is?
I was very surprised to learn that Marshall had suffered from prostate cancer,
Uh-huh.
and that apparently was a defining moment in
Yes.
his decision to become more of an activist.
Yes. Well, the last decades of his life, I think included a trip once a month to Los Angeles for some kind of treatment related to cancers and the like. So yes, it was I believe a decades long
Wow.
thing that he dealt with. Yeah, absolutely. Let me go do one more. I'm going to do one more. Find my screen. I need a reader. This is from Cheryl McNamara. And I'm going to ask someone to just start reading from Cheryl McNamara's segment. It's on page 17 in the online version. I would like to have a volunteer to read some of this, and then we'll get someone else. Do we have a volunteer?
I'll do it.
Okay,
no.
great.
Well, let's see. Iona has volunteered.
Okay, great. Iona, go ahead.
Okay, I start when I lay down.
No, that was the feeling Cheryl McNamara had with her
start with-
work.
Okay, that was the feeling Cheryl McNamara had with her work in Toronto, Canada. McNamara's route into action was also prompted by a book, in her case, Ronald Wright's A Short History of Progress. Wright shows how civilizations like the Mayans and the Polynesian society on Easter Island rose and fell because they gobbled up the environment that sustained them. McNamara had been alarmed years earlier by the toll climate change was taking, but she quickly put it to the back of her mind, but not this time. When I laid down Ronald Wright's book, I envisioned myself as an elderly woman on her deathbed, ashamed that I could have done something about this problem, but did nothing. And now that I lay dying, I was powerless to do anything. But it was not too late. I was in my prime, perfectly capable of helping to solve this gargantuan and dangerous problem.
What you do with
McNamara
it.
was experiencing one of these existential moments that launches a continued quest to save a life, to live a life that truly matters. She decided that she would start with herself and began chronicling her and her spouse's attempts to reduce their carbon footprint in a weekly blog called Carbon Slim. They stopped eating meat, bought local and organic produce, traveled by bicycle and public transit, reduced their air travel, changed all their light bulbs, reduced their garbage, bought a small home, learned to grow vegetables in their backyard, and brought their home's efficiency up from 43 to 76%. After all the effort and money to reduce our household carbon footprint, I realized that while it was much lower than the North American average, it wasn't enough. We needed help. We needed others to drastically reduce their personal footprints too, and only government policy could make that happen. Around that time, I was part of the communications team for a rally on Parliament Hill in Ottawa called C-Day, Fill the Hill. Two things struck me about that experience. One, that journalists are, for the most part, clearly uneducated on the issue. And two, we spent a lot of time and effort on an event that was largely ignored outside of the few thousand people who made a lot of noise outside Parliament that day. I asked myself, what was preventing us from going inside and actually talking to policy and lawmakers about this pressing problem? Why weren't we doing that? Her question, what was preventing us from going inside and actually talking to policy and lawmakers about this pressing problem, reverberates through our mostly hollow lives as citizens. That is the question for all mouse click advocates who are serious about systemic change and who want to do more than just lift a finger for the next mouse click. The sad answer as to why we aren't going inside and actually talking to the lawmakers is that most people who want big change cannot find an organization capable of empowering them at a level equal to their desire for change. Most organizations ask us for nothing more than a click and a check. They see us as little children who are too busy with play, too distracted, too naive, and too incapable of doing the homework necessary to go really deep with our democracy.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Anyone want to comment on anything that stood out for you? I'm going to make a statement in a moment, but I want to hear from you first. Something that struck you?
Somehow it didn't strike me so much when I read it earlier, but boy, that sentence, we ask you for more than a click and a check, is a good sentence in trying to get people to become true advocates in the organization.
Yes, great. Thank you. And Jonathan, thank you.
Melissa,
Okay.
yeah, a couple things. I keep thinking about Marshall Sanders and get out of your comfort zone. But that, yeah, you have to go in, use your voice and talk. That just, signing a petition, even a lot of petitions, which I do, is not enough. That you have to go in and tell them what your view is and why you feel that way, and get others to do that too. I go inside. I like that.
Yeah. Why aren't we going inside where the policymakers are? Thank you so much. Cheryl?
I was really going to say the same thing. That struck me about CCL initially when I started attending conferences and hearing more about this amazing organization. Individual actions are great, but probably by now, most of the individuals who are going to take individual actions have done that. And protests, they're great too, but then you just go home and what happens? It just made so much sense to me that you want to go inside and start talking to people using that appreciative, grateful, listening attitude. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl. We're going to go to John in a moment, but I want to relay this story. I tell it all the time, where I was talking to the head of organizing for a large group you would know very well, who said to me, we can't let our volunteers write letters to the editor or op-eds because they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. Well, so much for empowerment. And I always give the example, last year CCL had more than 4,000 whatever letters, op-eds, and editorials published. One group is saying they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization, and CCL's asking, well, what do we have to do to help them get it right, and give that to them. And the difference is obvious. So thank you again, Cheryl. And John?
Well, that passage just reminded me of how I came to CCL myself, because I'd been giving money to different environmental organizations for a long time, like $30 here and there. And then after the 2016 election, when we elected a president who said climate change was a hoax, I just knew that giving a little money to 350.org was not enough. And I did a Google search on the phrase climate change volunteer, and up comes Citizens Climate Lobby. So that's exactly how I got here myself.
Yeah, great. Very good. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next chapter. And the next chapter included 13 commitments that I saw as needed to have this kind of deeper advocacy work. And the question was, which are your two strongest areas among the 13, and which are two areas for growth? And I'm going to just be quiet for a moment and see if someone would like to say, well, as I read through them, this one is really a place I blossomed, or whatever. This is an area that I really could use some growth in. Cheryl, is your hand up from before or from right now?
It's up from before.
Okay, good. Okay. Could anyone just say, I'm going to ask you to read the commitment out loud. Again, I've got several that I've selected, but I'd like to hear and not step on any toes first, and let you see if there's one, or for example, that stood out for you as a strength, or one you've grown into. And if there's another that is an area for growth. I'll be quiet for just a moment. Okay, Sabrina, which one, which are we, is it an area of strength, or is it an area for growth? And which is the one that you?
Yeah, I guess in a way they could be related, in that an area of growth is a chance to grow stronger, right?
Yeah.
So I think being vulnerable.
Okay, great. If you don't mind, I'm going to pull that one up on the screen, and then we'll hear from you. Do you want to say something about it? I'm going to actually ask you to read it, but do you want to say something first?
Well, it's hard to be vulnerable, right? I mean, we, especially today, where I think today's society is like, you need to be right about things. And to be vulnerable means to me that you're open to being wrong. And you're open to, well, being wrong and being attacked, both. I mean, yeah. Because, well, everybody wants to be light, everybody wants to be right, right? So with those two messaging, to be vulnerable is to realize that you're not going to be light and you're not going to be right.
Yes, great. And so do you hold it a bit more as an area for growth? Maybe you've gotten much stronger in it since you've joined CCL, perhaps, but even still, it's an area for growth, or do you see it as a strength, full stop?
Oh, definitely area for growth. I mean, it's so
Okay.
hard to be vulnerable, right?
Yep.
You could do this for decades until it's a lifelong thing, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah. So would you mind reading that excerpt? I think you can see it, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. Being vulnerable, showing an emotional video or reading convincingly an excerpt from an evocative article to a member of Congress is more important than just sharing information. The goal is to tap into the humanity and create a deeply memorable moment. If your issue is poverty, for example, the goal is to have the meeting be as close to the actual field visit as possible. But people shy away from being vulnerable, especially with those in position of power. Bringing an emotionally moving video or reading to a member of Congress can make a volunteer feel especially vulnerable. Instead, we are more likely to hide behind a presentation of facts and figures. However, a willingness to be vulnerable is essential to having breakthroughs, engaging others, building powerful relationships, and ultimately success.
Okay, great. Thank you. So my question, and I'm going to probably tell you a story in a moment. My question is, can someone share a way that you've been in a congressional meeting or staff meeting and you were able to be vulnerable? You were able to share a deeply felt reading or video or something that took some, let's call it guts, to kind of come off the facts and figures page. Anyone want to share about that kind of moment?
I can share if you like.
Yes, sure, please.
Sure. So one of the meetings we had in 2016 was particularly difficult, especially the Democratic office in November 2016. It was like the person was not hearing at all because this was the chief of staff of one of the members of Congress we met. And seems to me, it took me a while to realize how much he felt like he was outside of his own government and he didn't understand what was happening to his own country. And all he could do was point to, the people he totally disagreed with.
Yeah.
And I basically begged him to please understand that we need to get together to solve this big problem, that it was not. And of course, I got emotional about it because I think I started with acknowledging that I can't imagine how difficult it feels for him to be in this situation where he has worked so hard for so many years, and it just seemed like he didn't understand, what happened to his own country. Mm-hmm. And I said, I can't imagine how difficult that must be because you've put in a lot of work into this. However, we need to come together as a country to solve this big issue. And I'm asking you now, please. I mean, I can't remember exactly because 2016, but basically I was like as close to begging anybody to please see that we needed to come together as a country.
And how many of you were in that meeting? Were there 3 or 4 or 5 of you? Or?
Yeah, there was about 5 of us at CCL because we were pretty good at keeping it to 5 in those days in a meeting.
And any takeaway from that moment, that kind of stone cold kind of lost, and then you're sharing, and then
he did like have a bit of a breakthrough. I think he did, but it was I think what needed to be said. I mean, I wasn't sure like how we were going to end the meeting because it just seemed like, I thought, well, okay, I get that we're not going to get very far today, so we either end it and just call it a day because or I just be able to share that we're here because we think this is very important, and so I can't remember the words, but it just sort of came pouring out of my mouth because I just thought this has to be said because it just feels good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Very good. Thank you so much for being vulnerable right here, right now about that moment 5 years ago almost, that you were vulnerable in that moment. I'm going to share a little story. I'm coaching a staff member for another organization. We just started. We're doing this in the old CCOA with an inviting team who then invites people to the launch workshop. And she had her first inviting team call on the planet yesterday. And at the beginning of the inviting team call, she read an excerpt from the poem by Drew Dellinger, Hieroglyphic Stairway. And I'm going to read a little of it. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unraveling? Surely you did something when the seasons started failing, as the mammals, reptiles, birds were all dying. What did you do once you knew? It's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the earth was unraveling? And that's just an excerpt from that poem. But that was so, I mean, she's now coming up with a way to contextualize it, because one person couldn't handle the depth of it, basically, and the sadness that it brought up. Is there anyone else on this point of being vulnerable, or we'll go to one more? Let me just see if there's.
I can go.
Yes.
So whenever I started lobbying or doing advocacy, I was always nervous because all these legislations that were complicated and they were confusing, and I wanted like studying them well to, you know, have the right information in front of the members of Congress. And I always got intimidated because it's intimidating to go lobbying that, right? There's people in power positions. And an indigenous friend of mine told me, like, don't stress about any legislation. Talk about your personal story and your climate impact, which I had a lot. And that for me was a moment of being vulnerable. Talk about what is being hard, what was happening in my community. And every time a volunteer comes to me, always nervous about, oh my God, this legislation, I don't know what to say, or, you know, I'm meeting with this important person. Don't worry, what is really important here is your personal story and how this is affecting you, and being vulnerable that way. It makes more impact in an office than bringing whatever facts you can bring, no matter where it comes from.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Let me ask this. Does anyone have one more, a different? Yes, go ahead, Cheryl. Which one is it that you're looking at?
Oh, I was still going with vulnerable. I was going
Go
to talk
for
about
it.
them.
Yes, go
Okay.
vulnerable. Go for it.
So I had just joined CCL. It was my first national conference, and it was lobby day. And I decided to put in a framed picture, probably 5 by 7 or so, of my granddaughter and take it along. And I knew this was a bit gimmicky, but I also knew that I wanted it to be clear that I wasn't just speaking for me, I was speaking for my granddaughter as well. So I pulled it out of my briefcase and I put it on the table. And I said that I'm here not just for me, but for my granddaughter. And I think I felt very vulnerable doing that because I knew it was a bit of a gimmick, but I also knew that I really felt that. And I was hoping that my true feelings would come through. Yeah. And some people, the staffers handled that very well. They did not make me feel, they made me feel unembarrassed by doing it. Great. But I don't know, it was very opening myself to being vulnerable, and I knew I was doing that.
Great, thank you. Can we go to a different one? Does either you feel it's a strength or maybe it's an area for growth? Would someone select another one? And so if you'll let me know if there's someone raising their hand.
Sarah?
Sorry, who is
Sarah?
that?
Yeah.
Sarah?
Let's
Please.
let's do empowering breakthroughs.
Okay, great. It's one of the ones I picked. So I'm going to find it and share it. Why don't you talk about it first? What comes up? What insight? Is it a strength? Is it an area of growth?
I would have, in my professional life, I managed a lot of people, and I would have said that empowering breakthroughs was absolutely a strength of mine in the work world. In my time as a CCL chapter leader, CCL co-chapter leader, it's not, we're not experiencing as many breakthroughs as I would like to see. This is very scary stuff. You know, things happen, like you go to give a presentation at a Rotary Club meeting, and there's a climate denier there who's extremely vociferous, and it knocks both of the presenters right off their pegs. And then, you know, everybody crawls back in their hole. And somebody has a conversation with a brother-in-law that goes badly, and then it's really hard to sustain talking about climate is very hard. And so empowering breakthroughs is not something I feel like I've done well at all.
So would you read this first and then?
Sure. For a citizen to go from not knowing the name of their member of Congress to having a deep, trusted relationship with them requires a series of breakthroughs. It requires moving out of their comfort zone. That is essentially the definition of a breakthrough: seeing something that seems difficult or impossible, having some discomfort and taking it on, and then with coaching and support, going through that comfort zone to experience the joy and accomplishment on the other side. These breakthroughs can happen with a member of Congress, with an editorial writer, with other leaders in the community, or with oneself. Empowering others in this way and providing opportunities for them to express their greatness is one of the gifts of deep advocacy.
Okay, so let me ask this question. You were very clear about the times there might have been a Rotary talk and a climate denier. And you were very clear about the times that there was a conversation with a brother-in-law. Are you equally clear about the times that there was a breakthrough and in a next step with never had a letter to the editor published, or finally got through the editorial writer, but they were so new and said, well, I'm not going to write an editorial. Why don't you write an op-ed and we'll publish it, or any other kind of breakthrough? Are we good at finding the times there, as good at finding the times there is a breakthrough as we were at finding times when there was a breakdown?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that, you know, we've had the letters to the editor are an example of where we've got a good process for coaching people into that.
Great.
And then celebrating successes.
Okay, great. Great. And when my letters to the editor is published, am I encouraged to post it on social media?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Am I encouraged to send it to the members of Congress, or the liaison sends it to the member of Congress?
Oh yeah, all that happens. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah.
Good.
No, that's really great. I think that it's I think this is difficult work that we do, and getting, it's a little bit like the difference between if you work in the arts, you know, if you are an actor, if you're a musician, then you try and you go to a call to be in a role, and you try out and you try out and you try out, and you get told no and no and no and no. And our work is a little bit more like that than like a lot of endeavors where you don't expect to encounter quite so much difficulty prior to successes.
Okay, very good, very good. Here's what I'm going to do to close. Well, I'm going to read. At the beginning of COVID, I started writing another book, and one section of the book had a 14th commitment, and it was not a commitment focused so much on volunteers as on staff, but I want you to hear it. I want to make this point. If you're interested in joining the Civic Courage mailing list, send an email to me at sam@civiccourage.org and just put list, and I would put you on the mailing list. Okay, this is the new commitment. This is not in any chapter you read. It's not from Reclaiming Our Democracy. So let me read this. In the final chapter of Reclaiming Our Democracy, I listed 13 commitments needed for deep advocacy to succeed. While the list is quite exhaustive, it only alludes to one ingredient that I now see as a central reason for an organization's failure with deep advocacy: the unwillingness of most staff to make big asks of volunteers. This reluctance is grounded in the fear of being told no, the fear of failure. In Reclaiming Our Democracy, I describe the fear that volunteers experience, a fear that makes it hard to pick up the phone and call an editorial writer or call a congressional aide in DC for an in-depth discussion. But this book is more focused on the fear experienced by staff, a fear that stops deep advocacy in its tracks. Here's an example of what I mean. I had just begun working with the organization a week earlier and had sent the new staff member a script calling to see if any of the key volunteers would be willing to help launch a new chapter. The chapter would be a group of citizens committed to the organization's mission, who would be trained and empowered to champion the group's priorities. After reading through the script, I asked the staff member to edit it, to make it his own, As if to underscore my point, this is the first sentence he added. First, don't worry, I'm not expecting you to make some major time commitment or give me a kidney. There it is, the fear of making big asks of volunteers, apologizing in advance for whatever ask will be made, and preparing to water it down. It's understandable that someone would say that, but it's also a prescription for failure. Here's an example from a different organization. I'd worked with a staff member for 12 weeks, and we often discussed that new chapter members would start with a 4-part new group training and then move to 2 meetings per month. As we approached the day when she would make that request in front of a room full of people for the very first time, she blurted out, "Well, I wouldn't agree to 2 meetings per month myself." "Well, then," I replied, "we're looking for people who would agree to 2 meetings per month. But asking others to do what you would never do yourself is another recipe for disaster. It's true that no one wants to commit to attending 2 meetings a month if up too much, if the volunteers won't experience significant growth. But if the organization is a place where transformation happens, then some people will step up." Here's another example of what I mean by deep advocacy. I coached Citizens Climate Lobby its first 7 years. When CCL was launched by Marshall Saunders at the end of 2007, They had 0 chapters, no staff, just Saunders, and a non-existent mailing list, just Saunders' personal contacts. But here's a glimpse of what they've built. In 2010, the volunteers had 65 letters to the editor, op-eds, and editorials published. In 2019, the number published was 4,301. That's an average of nearly 12 published pieces a day. In 2010, the volunteers had 106 meetings with members of Congress or their staff. In 2019, there were 1,714 such meetings, an average of more than 4.5 meetings a day. Of course, they don't happen spread out like that. The numbers alone make it clear that something extraordinary is going on. What nonprofit advocacy group wouldn't want that? Many seemingly don't. I'm reminded of the diner orgasm scene from the movie When Harry Met Sally, and the patron a few tables away tells the waiter, "I'll have what she's having." This book addresses why more nonprofits aren't saying, "I'll have what they're having." The book will explain why deep advocacy looks so unattainable to most nonprofits and why they believe it requires skills they could never imagine their organization having. Now, I'm not sure if that was useful, but anyway, because it was one of those commitments that's a bit more staff focused, but it kind of looks into kind of our predicament. So I'm going to close with a thank you. If you'd like to be on the Civic Courage mailing list, sam@civiccourage.org. If you'd like to get Reclaiming Our Democracy, I encourage you to do that, the whole book. This is the quote I will say twice and say good night. Thank you to the regional coordinators who helped make this happen, to everyone who attended. This is from Alex Steffen, a climate activist, who said, "Optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy with a large population of people who believe nothing will get any better. In fact, these days, cynicism is obedience." I love that. In fact, these days, cynicism is obedience. What's really radical is being willing to look right at the magnitude and difficulty of the problems we face and still insist that we can solve those problems. End of quote. And I think I will leave it there, even though I usually say it twice. I think I won't this time, in order to end on time. I love you guys. I'm so